Joe Twyman, founder of Delta Poll, we bow down to your brilliance. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Yes, I'm good, thank you.
Good God, it's busy this morning, man.
It is. It's a day.
It is a day. Now, the thing we've sort of talked before. You're one of the few pollsters that I like talking to because you're always quite straight. A lot of them are very set in what they think is going to happen. I don't know how many polls it is, but the latest opinion poll, I think, is number 160 or something that puts reform in the lead. This time as well, Labour third, Tories climbing a little bit. Couple of points that I wanted to ask you. There has been a little reform drop-off. There has been a little bit of a Tory increase. Labour collapsing. And Hypno Boobs, as I call him, Zach Polanski, what's happening with the Greens? All of those questions, all in one, my friend.
Yes, so what it's really important to think about is not individual polls, but instead the long-term trend, which is what you've talked about, but not talking about the number of polls, but the amount of time that those trends have lasted for. And it's since May, really, since the local elections, that reform have been ahead in every single published poll. And certainly the long-term trend is one of a lead between sort of 7 to 10 points, depending on which polls you look at. More recently, however, there has been a slight drop-off in reform in those long-term trends, and that, at least so far, appears to be benefiting the Conservatives.
Why is that? Is that just Badenoch's grabbed the nettle, do we think? Do you think it's... What do you think?
Well, it's unlikely to be just one thing, and instead a combination of a number of them. Obviously, Kemi Badenoch is an important part of the Conservative Party's story, for good or bad, and she has improved her situation
I interviewed her the other day.
Definitely. Over the last few months. She's still in a situation where 1 in 5 people actually doesn't know whether she's doing a good or bad job at all, which is an issue for her. But
would it be fair to say to you as a pollster that she reminds me, I'm afraid, very much of William Hague, probably the right leader at the wrong time? If you were asking me as a voter, I would say that even if I started to warm to Tory policies, right, they need to serve what I call their penance for allowing this bunch of whatevers to be in power, but also for all the lies and mistakes that they made. I think a lot of people out there that you would poll would probably agree with that sentiment.
There's a really good argument to say she's a great Conservative leader for 2010, not for 2026, which is. But of course, you can't choose your era. It's just the situation you have. Labour have consistently been really neck and neck with the Tories now for a number of months. Essentially, it's statistically insignificant, the difference between the two. In other words, they're neck and neck. And then you have the rise of the Greens, which has occurred since the selection of Zach Polanski as leader. And so now you have a situation where Reform are falling back slightly, and then below them, 6, 7, 8 points behind, are not just Labour and Conservatives, but Lib Dems and Greens as well.
What are the Lib Dems at? Another non-entity.
Well, they're on similar numbers in some polls as well, 15, 16%.
And of course, for Nigel Farage and for Reform and for leading yes in 161 polls, the reality is that many people in Reform, and in fact many people in the country, and this I guess is the argument, this is what the man needs to do in the next 3 years with his team, is to make sure that the establishment, as I call it, Labour and Polanski and the Lib Dems, that there is an answer to them doing anything possible to stop him getting into 10 Downing Street. Do any of your trends show you that he can do this on his own? Because there's been murmurings of, you'll need to go with the Tories and they both say yes and they both say no, or whatever they say, it doesn't matter. I know that Nigel Farage would want to become Prime Minister with a working majority. Anything in the polls that show that?
Well, Zach Polanski, firstly, I think would argue that he's certainly not part of the establishment. But that's an important point, the sort of...
No, I'm talking about the establishment, the mass media, whoever you want to talk about it.
Reform versus anti-reform, I think, is the way to look at it. And when you look at the polling, actually, one interpretation of it is it's actually good news for Nigel Farage and Reform, because in a situation where you have a 4-5 party race in individual constituencies, or even a 6-party race in Scotland or in Wales with Plaid and the SNP, you could have a situation where you only need 20-25% of the vote to win in the constituency.
I agree. And actually the argument against why, or rather for the uniparty thing that's always worked, is I remember when the SDP started out and when the Liberal Democrats, they'd end up with 10,000 votes in every constituency, sometimes 20, lots of seconds, lots of consistent support, but never the Tories, south of Watford Gap will get 60,000 in each constituency and win 350 seats, and north of what for gap will get nothing, and it didn't matter because that's how the vote panned out. Reform, I'm thinking, probably, and the Greens, I don't want to get involved, would probably have consistent support in all constituencies across the UK.
Well, it's certainly true for a number of constituencies, but there is still variation. First past the post hurts parties until it really doesn't, and then it helps them. But it's worth pointing out that the SDP that you mentioned, in the early 1980s, they were on more than 50% of the vote in some polls, and 9 years later getting beaten by the monster raving loony party in a by-election.
Do you genuinely believe that Nigel Farage and Reform can win an overall majority at the next election?
They certainly can, but we don't know what's going to happen in the next 3.5 years. It's within the last 3.5 years that Boris Johnson was talking about his plans for a third term. Yeah. So an awful lot can happen.
And it was only, 18 months ago that Keir Starmer walked into Downing Street with the biggest post-war majority, and look what's happened there. It's actually a paper majority, because I think he's in trouble.
We can speculate about routes for Nigel Farage to become Prime Minister. We can speculate for routes for Reform to completely collapse. But it is just that, speculation. Polling is only ever a snapshot of where we are at the moment.
When you're out in the street or when you're doing your polling, what are people saying about the Prime Minister? Is that a recoverable position by Labour, do you think?
Well, if the last 10 or 15 years of British politics have taught us anything, it's that nothing can be ruled out, but also nothing can be guaranteed. So can it be recovered? Yes, but every day that goes past and the Prime Minister and the government's position does not improve, it makes it more difficult and less likely that it will improve.
There was a story in the newspaper today. I mean, I made light of it. It's frightening. Most 12-year-olds do not realise that they will be able to vote in the next election. This research said they hold strong views. I have a 12-year-old and they don't. They want to play the PlayStation. What are you talking about? I don't know what you feel as a pollster. Dropping the age to 16. People who are 12 right now could pick our next Prime Minister. It's too young, isn't it?
Well, people who are 12 inevitably would have picked up next Prime Minister in 6 years as well. And you could argue that they're not paying attention now, but they don't need to pay attention now because they're not going to be voting until they're 16.
But I mean, I'm talking about the ones that will be 16 straight away, and then within a day or two they can vote in a general election.
I think there's strong arguments for and against it. Yeah, I do think there are. But I think whatever happens, it has to be accompanied by serious efforts within schools to inform people.
Oh, we're going to have an argument now.
Because
our schools are utterly run by many people who have a complete objective, which is, and I'm not just saying this, but left of centre. We know that.
I think the situation is more complicated. Not all schools.
Not all schools at all.
But I stress there should be an important move from schools to inform people of their responsibility to vote, because there's a lot of evidence that if you don't vote in the first opportunity you're given, you then, if you like, don't get into the habit.
I think it's a really interesting point that you've made, actually, because whether there's responsibility on schools or parents or whatever, parents should take a responsibility as well. One of my real pet hates is people who moan and bitch and quite rightly get upset by government decisions, and then you find out they didn't vote. I believe that exercising your democratic right is probably the most important thing that we have. And one thing I was going to say to you is, I mean, one thing I do feel very strongly about is that the silent majority who for years have accepted many things, whatever their politics, have worked out that their vote and their voice can be important and can be used.
Yeah, and that's very important to the health of any democracy, that people do exercise their vote. And obviously people have a right not to vote as well, but if they choose not to vote, they must accept the consequences that
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? Everybody moans about Sadiq Khan, me the most, but 1 million people in London voted in the last mayoral election, and 11.8 million people live here. People just didn't come out. So if you're going to come out, vote as you want to vote. That's your democratic right. But don't sort of carp from the sidelines in the end if it doesn't work out. Prediction time. I know you're 3 years. Well, he doesn't like this at all, Joe, does he? Does Nigel Farage enter Downing Street in 3 years? In your opinion as a pollster?
Well, no, I can't give you my opinion as a pollster because polls are not a prediction.
All right. What about your opinion as a...
I think at the moment it's the most likely outcome, but it is by no means guaranteed.
Polls? Do you do polls amongst MPs, or is it just?
We don't, but
does Keir Starmer survive the next 12 months?
I think, again, not the most likely outcome, but I can certainly see perfectly reasonable reasons for why he does. I think the May local elections will be hugely important.
And what's polling saying about May? Are you doing polling?
Well, because it's only a specific set of constituencies, it's difficult. But Scotland and Wales clearly present a serious challenge for Labour.
Scotland and Wales, of course, they're holding the Senate and the Scottish Parliament's elections, so that's would-be MPs. I don't think Reform will win Scotland. It will be to come second and oust Labour to the SNP. But then the SNP had a terrible, terrible time, didn't it, with the problems of Nicola Sturgeon and motor caravans and money in the garden.
But as lots of different parties have shown, whether it's the Greens, whether it's Reform, or whether it's the SNP, your performance in individual areas, even whole nations, or councils or particular constituencies, doesn't necessarily impact on your vote when it comes to elections.
It must be fascinating what you do, actually, when you cut it all down. Do you find it must be interesting to see how all these... You can tell, can you? As well, what I always find really astonishing. I remember watching Julia on the night of the election, and they do that prediction at 10 o'clock, and I've watched it for years, and it always turns out to be incredibly accurate before they've even counted the votes. It fascinates me how it works, because many pollsters get things absolutely spot on. Some don't by a mile, but more often than not, the polls are very accurate.
Well, there's always a margin of error associated with every poll, and you can't abolish that because it's to do with the laws of probability, and you can't abolish those in the way you can't abolish the laws of gravity. But generally speaking, in this country, within that margin of error, polling has been relatively accurate compared to actual outcomes. But as I say, the polling at the moment is not a prediction of where we will be in 3.5 years. It's a representation of where we are at the moment.
Completely. Great to have you on, Joe. Joe Twyman, founder of the Delta poll. We'll be using him lots. It is 3.5 more years of this, Pete. We'll get